Alrighty, welcome back to my channel, Maybe Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today I'm so excited to be hosting a deep dive for the Dandelion Dynasty with the author himself, Ken Liu. We've been very lucky to be able to talk to Ken before about the first two books, and today we will be discussing all four. So, just a disclaimer, if you're watching this, there will be spoilers. So just be aware of that before we get talking. But thank you so much for joining us, Ken. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we're all kind of in different places with when we finished reading the Dandelion Dynasty, with our journey with it. I read it almost a year ago now. So for me, a lot of things that I still have embedded in my brain are larger plot points, themes, and it's something that I think about a lot. But I know that I'll let them speak for themselves, but Hans and Steve finished it much more recently. So I'm really interested to hear some of their fresher thoughts as well. But I wanted to start this conversation kind of going from the macro to the micro, because it's such a big thing to talk about. So one of the first things that comes to my mind in the macro regard is the last two books, The Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones, technically are supposed to be one big book, if I'm correct. Yes. But your publisher was like, absolutely not. And told you needed to change that. So I'm curious, from your perspective, are you kind of happy with the end result of them being split into two in retrospect, or is it something that you wish hadn't had to happen? Or
It's hard to say. My original thinking was the fact that the last book would be chopped in half would be a problem only for a couple months, meaning only the people who got to read the third book without the fourth book being out for a few months. That's an issue. And I tried my best to reassure people that, it's coming very soon. And my thinking was that after that point, it wouldn't matter because anybody who wanted to can read the two together and it would be essentially the same experience. What I didn't anticipate was that the fact that they are two physically separate books actually ended up mattering. Just in the same way that, Lord of the Rings came out in 3 volumes for essentially the same reason, ended up causing readers to treat the 3 books as actually 3 books, even if all of us can, in fact, buy the 3 volumes together and read them all the way through the way Tolkien intended. We still think of them as 3 distinct books and talk about them as 3 separate steps in one big story. And so, readers do treat these two as 2 parts of one story and then evaluate the books on their own. I somehow, I don't know, in my mind, I just didn't think that would be an issue, but that turned out to be, in fact, a thing that readers do react to. And there's nothing I can do about that. So I'm a little sad that I couldn't really fix that problem. In my mind, I do think it's better if somehow readers can forget the fact that there is a division between the two and really just treat the whole thing as one continuous book. But, technology of bookbinding being what it is, a very thick book like this would just be very expensive to produce and very off-putting to people. So I do completely understand why my publisher said that is not the right thing to do. So, I can't disagree with them on that point. I just don't know if there is a better solution. Maybe electronically, the ebooks can be published in such a way that it is, in fact, just 3 separate books, the whole series, the way I intended it. But physically, I don't know how to fix that problem. So the complicated, long-winded answer to your question, but I guess the answer is I don't think I could have done anything different to make it better. So I'm a little sad that the ultimate experience wasn't quite what I hoped. But I think we did the best we could. And I'll say one thing: the fact that we did end up getting these 2 books, getting what would have been the third book into 2 separate books, meant that I could talk to the publisher about the cover for the last book being something different. essentially the cover for the third book was done a few years ago, when I had just started thinking about how the third book would specifically go. So this was the cover design that I could think of at the time. But by the time the whole thing was done, this felt like a much more fitting cover. And there's a lot of symbolism in it, evoking the idea of rejuvenation and rebirth from the ashes and the corruption of the past, if you will. And so I was able to talk to the publisher about, designing the cover of the last book to be like this. So that's sort of a little bonus that in the end, because we have 4 books, we could do 4 covers and sort of tell a story in the covers that otherwise would be missing. So, you lose some, but you also gain some. So I was pretty happy about that.
I mean, there's outrage from your fans what they did with your covers. So
there's also this, which I never even noticed until the books came to me, and I was like, oh, I don't really understand what happened there. I still don't understand what happened there.
Like Patrick Leo has a whole video ranting on your behalf, and we were all like, yes, absolutely.
It is it's very interesting. I don't know what happened. I suspect that it's one of those things where there was some sort of corporate command to make covers uniform in some way, and they just did it without realizing that this would make the series look very strange.
Before we move on from the publishing aspect, you had a couple comments. Would it even be possible to bind a 2,000 plus page book? Imagine dropping that on your face in bed.
Well, that's what I was told. My publisher, they were like, look, it's just really, really expensive to bind a book that thick, and it will be very hard to read. There are some solutions. I mean, one is to use very thin paper, which would also drive up the cost, and also just it's not a good experience when it's like that, or reduce the print size, which is also a bad idea. So in the end, I do think they push me to the right answer. But yeah.
And I think you did answer a little bit of this one when you were talking about the covers there. But did you have input on the UK covers also, which I know Hans?
So not a whole lot. So the UK covers originally were just very similar to the US covers. They use the same art. Then later on, Head of Zeus decided to do their own cover, and I do like them. I didn't have a huge amount. Okay, let me put it this way. I also had some input in that I spoke with the artist and discussed what sort of symbols and items I wanted to emphasize on the covers. And they had taken the idea that they wanted the 4 covers to be put together side by side to form a painting. So there will be one story being told from beginning to end. I mean, I don't have the other 2 with me handy, but you can see how the cover art all fits together so that it's a nice long big painting. And I had some input into what sort of creatures and things would show up, and it ended up being really cool. So the Wall of Storms ended up being on the ocean between the 2 continents, or 2 land masses, and the bookend pieces were on the separate land masses. So it ended up being also kind of a progression, a journey, a story being told in pictures. I really like that. So yes. So all in all, I did enjoy the covers of the UK edition as well. I thought they did a great job.
It's very cool to actually see some of the inventions, not only described but also illustrated.
Yeah, that was very cool. It was neat.
Okay. Well, let's get into the nitty gritty, shall we? So those of you watching, spoilers may begin here. Just letting you know if you're watching the replay afterwards as well. So since we're talking about the whole series, let's start at the end, which is, did you know how this series, my question is how the series was going to end. Because when we talked to you before, you had mentioned it was a process. The story took you along with it. So I'm curious if you knew.
So my process has always been that I would know some of the landmarks I wanted to get to, if not the specific path by which I would get to them. So in the case of the ending, I knew what the last scene would be. So the very last scene of the entire series, I knew that. Actually, back when I was writing The Grace of Kings, I knew that would be the final scene. I did not know exactly on the way how we would get there. For example, when I was writing The Wall of Storms and The Grace of Kings, the Blossom Gang did not exist. They came in fact, during one of the revision passes for the final book. I also didn't know exactly what most of the characters, other than Thera and Zomi, what their fates would be. So they were. I sort of had an idea of what they would want to do, but exactly what fate had in store for them, I didn't know. So I was discovering, along with the process of writing, what would happen to them, and I did, in a lot of the cases, let the characters tell me what they wanted to do, and that was fun. I mean, another example, Zankara, Fyro's lover, she was not in my original plan at all. She also showed up essentially in one of the revision passes, and she had her own story. And so I let her tell her own story and let her do her own thing. And she didn't want to stay in Dara. So that's why she came in and she left. But so I would say I knew the large picture of what I wanted to do. That is, I wanted that final scene to be the final scene. I also wanted Dara itself to go through the process of getting onto the path to a constitutional monarchy, and perhaps in the future a republic. I wanted to make clear that was the path, because that was the entire project. The entire project was to give an alternative mythological origin to the idea of modernity, to the idea of a large modern state like the United States, but not based on a Greco-Roman mythological origin story, on a fantastical East Asian inspired origin story. So I knew that was what I wanted to do. I didn't know exactly how I would get there, but that's how I did it.
That when you finally you threw us a bone with Thera and Zomi, I was like, oh, thank God. Because I was like, Ken, you've done so much to me through this series. Give me something. Yeah. And you did.
Well, they were always going to get together, so that was not a problem.
That was the one positive thing I wanted to have at the ending of the series, to just have them at least end up together again.
Yep. That was very important.
And I was kind of scared for a second that you would leave Tara to die in the faraway lands.
I mean, that would have been an ending too, and perhaps some readers might think thematically that's even better in some sense. But I really wanted them to be together. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are not alone in that sentiment. Yeah. I know Steve said that he had some possibly spicy opinions. I don't know if the ending is one of those. While we're talking about the ending, if you...
It's a certain character that I was a fan of that I don't think most people probably like too much.
Okay, well, go for it. That'll be fun to talk about, yeah.
But I love Gia.
Yeah.
I don't love all the things she did, but I admire that. Admire her.
I do too. I mean, Steve, do you think Gia in the end would be considered a hero or a villain?
In time, she would be a hero. And with distance, with time, in the future, she would be recognized as a hero, but it would take some time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I agree with you, and also even have even now I still have some doubt about this. There are moments where I think about you know, whether she really is actually a hero. Her intentions certainly were, I think, for the most part, good, but I'm not convinced that her dedication to that vision was necessarily the best thing. And you know, one thing in the series has always been that there's very little, it's a very thin line that divides the madness of tyrants from this kind of selfless grace of kings. And I'm not sure which side of the line she ultimately ended up on. I think a lot of people would like to believe she ended up on the side of the grace of kings, but there are moments where I have my doubts. So, yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated.
Mhm.
I love her as a character. I don't love her as a person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So for me, the moment where she was definitely on the madness of Tyrant's side is when she decided to kill all of her guards. Like
Yeah.
for me, I was like,
Mhm.
come on, you know, like, do you have to? So that pushed me in my moral compass. Like, okay, how far am I willing to see this as sacrificial of only herself? Because at that point, it seemed like she was taking other people's sacrifices into her hands, and I was not a fan of that.
Yeah. You know, even bigger than that, at the very end of the book, there was a critique of Jia from the inhabitants of Ukyu Taasa, where the inhabitants are saying that, you know, you had this vision of peace for the vast majority of Dara, so you sacrifice us essentially in your little scheme. And that is, I think, perhaps of all the accusations against her, the one that weighs on me the most. That she believed that this was the right thing to do. And leaders make decisions like this all the time. You know, we will draw the line here and not here, and so these people will die, and that is the way it is. And we're always telling people. I mean, this is sort of the heart of so many stories that we're forced to make these decisions, essentially versions of the trolley problem. And there's never a good answer. Always we justify these sacrifices in some way, and always we're making sacrifices for other people, and it's hard. It's just hard.
Mhm.
Drew had a question, which is, do you think everything Gia did was worth it in the end? Because she did get results.
It's a really hard question to answer. I mean, you can sort of ask that of just about everything, right? You know, Alexander the Great, in his conquest, slaughtered many people. Was it worth it afterwards? I mean, how do you even measure that? I'm not sure how you even measure worth. You can talk about something like, say, the American Revolution. Um, was that worth it? I don't even know how you measure that, and who do you answer as? If you answer as one of the indigenous peoples, I'm sure your answer will be incredibly different than if you're the descendants of one of the settlers versus the descendant of one of the enslaved individuals. I don't know. You know, a question like, was the founding of the United States worth it? Who do you answer as, and how long do you wait to answer that question? I think it's the same thing here in Dara. I'm sure that some people would say, you know, Jia is the very beginning of our turn towards the republic that we have today. And so she is a great hero and the founding mother of the highest level. And some others might say, I don't think so. I don't agree with you that the ramifications of what she did still reverberate even today in a way that is very painful. So I don't know. I think it's really hard, you know, to sort of turn the question I asked Steve earlier on its head. Maybe the very idea of there being heroes and villains in history is flawed, and that is in fact what I tried to do with the series in the first place. That um, the people we call heroes are often not heroes, and the people we call villains are not necessarily villains. And in fact, it is almost impossible to find a hero or a villain in history. Everybody is just a human being doing the best they can in their limited circumstances, and no one can see what's going to happen beyond the very horizon of their lifetime. And it's arguable whether you should even plan for that, because you're not in control of that sort of thing. So how do you even judge your actions? Good Lord, I don't know.
No. And I think an interesting aspect to that is, so I live in the Netherlands, so I'm steeped with the European history around, and Gia sometimes feels to me like Napoleon. Like I haven't read too much up on him, but we still use roads. A big provincial road by my village was founded by Napoleon. We still drive on the same right. The entirety of Europe drives on the same side of the road because of Napoleon. There's certain laws because of Napoleon, and that's the things that people remember. But it's not necessarily the acts of violence that he committed that we remember. So it's kind of tough to see that put into perspective of history, of course.
You make a really good point. I mean, I really find it fascinating that we have a habit of just erasing that aspect of a lot of historical figures' legacy. I mean, for example, Genghis Khan was one of the worst mass murderers in history, and a mass rapist, a mass murderer, really the villain of the highest caliber. I really cannot think of there are very few individuals, perhaps, in contemporary history and modern history that are like that. And yet, it's amazing the degree to which people joke about his exploits. His massive rapes were now considered some sort of funny thing, and his mass slaughters are sometimes even celebrated. It's just incredible to me that people treat him that way. So I don't really understand why so many figures who are horrible people in the worst of the worst can be somehow admired. We do seem to have a habit of admiring people who are strong in the sense of killing a lot of people. It's weird, but we do seem to have a way of forgiving people and end up celebrating them for killing a lot of people. I maybe that is an aspect of human nature that will eventually evolve and change. I certainly hope so. But yeah, when I think about Gia, I think about all the way she tried to limit the number of people who died as much as she could, and I think about the way she tried to minimize violence, and I think that's one of the reasons I do think she is really interesting and important. She certainly also caused a lot of suffering because of her dedication to her cause, but whatever else she was very, very dedicated to the idea of killing as few people as possible, and that makes her different from a lot of other leaders, and I do really admire her for that.
That's an extremely, interesting point, because something that bothered me about Gia and bothers me about characters in general, or characters that get on my nerves, are like the sneaky ones. And so even though her goal was to kill less people are much more likely to see someone like Mata Zindu as a hero.
Yeah.
Because he embodies that military strength that we uphold. Yeah. Whereas Gia embodies more of like a sneaky, something that you're not supposed to applaud. That's right. Say, at least in most societies. So I think it just occurred to me hearing you say that one of the things I dislike about her is because her violence is behind the scenes and not up front.
That's right.
Even though she probably overall tried to kill less people.
That's right. That's right. And even that is interesting. I mean, I think her arc in the end is, Kogo was the one who essentially saved her reputation. I mean, she wanted to sacrifice herself, including her name, forever to in the service of a better Dara. And Kogo convinced her that was actually not the way to go. That anything based on a lie is never going to work. I mean, this is something that's very important to me as well. The series is very much a reflection on history, and in particular, the nature of history in a country like the United States. We have a huge amount of debate over how to teach history. There's even, somebody like Governor DeSantis who wants to make it a legal requirement that we cannot teach history as a history of oppression, that we must celebrate the United States and not make its history of oppression the core. But I think that's ludicrous. How can you properly celebrate the United States without acknowledging the foundation in the dispossession and near genocide of the indigenous peoples, as well as the enslavement of an entire people by racial identity? If you cannot acknowledge these things, or even the exclusion of entire peoples by racial identity from even being able to become Americans, if you don't acknowledge these parts of history and honestly face them, you're always going to be telling your story based on a lie, in essentially the same way Gia was hoping people would do. And Kogo's thing is, we just cannot do that. So one of the things that I do think Dara does better than we have done is that in the end, after all the suffering, Dara's answer is, we're not going to seek revenge because that's not justice. We're going to try to do the best we can to move on, but we're not going to forget. We're going to record all the testimonies of all the people who have gone through this, from the oppressors and from the victims, and we're going to keep on remembering them, and we're going to remember them, and we're going to try to acknowledge all of these terrible things and then try to build something better in the future. We cannot forget, and it's not our place to forgive. Only the people who died can forgive. It's not in our power to do that. We can only atone and try to move forward. I think that's the right attitude. We can only atone, do the best we can, and try to move forward. I think Gia in the end was saved by Kogo's little speech, prodding her to submit to the judgment of history, if you will, and to allow all her acts be known, and then to be judged accordingly. And I think that ultimately was the thing that saved her reputation.
Oh, he's the multiverse.
My internet keeps cutting
there we go. That kind of reminds me of a microcosm moment with the same kind of feeling to it, which is, am I going to pronounce her name right? Diana, Timu and Tamanaki's daughter.
Yeah.
So she ends up stepping up into a place of leadership, but she acknowledges her very existence came from an instance of violence. I don't want to,
That's right.
use too many trigger words on YouTube. I don't know what they'll do to me, but
beyond that, right?
Yeah, but she is a product of sexual assault. We'll put it that way, and she has to acknowledge this fact. It cannot be escaped, and then try to find a way forward between the two peoples that she's now a part of, that whether she wants to be or not. So that kind of almost seems like a little microcosm of what you were just talking about on a larger scale.
Yeah, you're right. That's something Thera brought up too, that, in these cycles of violence, we end up, the very idea of drawing our boundaries so clearly is flawed, because lived reality is so much more messy and complex than that, and our identities are intersectional and crosses these boundaries, and we cannot draw these boundaries the way we think we are. We are all in some ways descended from a mixture of the oppressors and the victims. We all are, and it's our job to figure out what to do with that. We're born into history. We don't get to choose the world that we're born into and the legacy that we inherit. I think a common tendency is to say, let's forget about that. Let's just move on. Let's just forget. And I'm very opposed to that. I don't believe you should forget. You can't forget. you have to actually remember all these things that happen because they are a part of you. You don't know where you can go unless you know where you come from. You have to know what has been done in your name, what has been lost, and what sufferings have happened to allow you to even exist. You know, the very land you stand on is land that's filled with blood and tears and sweat, and you have to honor all of that in order to go forward to build your own legacy. And um, yeah, it's not easy, but I think the knowledge of history sometimes, oftentimes actually, is freeing. It's not meant to be confining. It's freeing in the sense of allowing you to understand and see that um, you are born into responsibility. You know, one way to think of that is that we're all born into sin, the sins of our ancestors and predecessors. But another way to think about it is that we're born into responsibility, to atone, to do well, to not cause more suffering. So that's how I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Are those the things that you liked about Gia too, Steve? The fact that she
Yeah,
did
I did wonder what she would be viewed like later in the future, if she would be a hero or a villain. But I mean, I think partially why we want to forget is because is it like guilt that we want to forget about it? Like we don't want to think about those terrible things that happened for the life we have now, but something we have to face.
Yeah. And then we also have to think about reparations and things like that, and it makes us very uncomfortable. And it's hard, but I don't think we can move on without. I don't think we can have reconciliation without truth. So we need that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of people who did not get justice, Timu.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That.
Wow.
Listen. Like I understand things can't always be tied with a bow, but to me, I was like, wow, just we come back to the scene and his head is gone. And I was like, no, poor baby, you know. That traumatized me a little bit. I don't know how Stephen Hans felt about that, but
it's pretty awful. Yeah.
well, it's good to at least hear the person who created it admit that.
I did give him you know, I think the arc that was suitable to his character. I mean, you know, Timu is someone who was very idealistic and who always believed these books that he read would give the answers to life's problems, and you know they didn't. But he loved them, and he's someone who abhorred violence and was. But in a society, in the world that he was in, he had very little power to effect change. He couldn't really do much. He tried to do what he could, but there was just very little for him to do given the society he found himself in. And I do think that in the end, you know, he was able to. I mean, he had he was in a horrible position. He really couldn't do anything, and he did the best he could. I mean, his knowledge was in language, letters, and the beauty of clever rhetorical tropes, and he was able to use that skill to get justice for himself and to bring down the most despicable character in the book, if you will, from beyond the grave, and that is a measure of heroism, and that is actually I am actually very proud of him for being able to do that in the end.
Yeah, despicable characters, Nodami. I don't know if I've ever felt such hatred. Like when him and Timu had that moment, they were alone, and he didn't go for Timu right away. I was like, maybe, but I was giving him too much credit. Like you taught me earlier in the series not to give him that credit, and I did it anyway.
You just can't trust Noda on anything. I mean, you know, his Noda is. I mean, I know people like that. It's almost hard to figure out, you know, how they do what they do, because they really only think of themselves. Because they only think of themselves, they think the world is full of people like themselves. And so it must be such a depressing, ugly world that they inhabit, or they think, because they think everyone else is exactly like them. Um, I don't know how they even stand themselves, but people are like that.
That's a good way to put it. Don't know how they stand themselves. But they almost always succeed, right? Those are the people
In some way,
who
yeah,
actually live in history.
it's true. It's true. I mean, we have a lot of narcissistic people like that who seem to succeed for a while at least. Sometimes even all the way until the moment they die. But yeah, I don't know. It's a mystery that we allow these people to go as far as they do.
Did you feel the same hatred I did, Steve, or were you just like?
Yeah, I usually like that. Yeah, but yeah, it was tough. It's tough. But Ken, you had mentioned that you wrote the story over the course, I think you said 10 years.
Yeah.
That you lived in Dara. What was it like to open those gates and to let everyone in a world that you had just had in your head and on paper?
It was really cool. I mean, it's this is one of the greatest pleasures of being a writer, really. So, you create this world, and you're the only one who can see it and know anything about it. You write the books and you bring it out there, and then you hear from readers who have read it, and they tell you, how they felt. And you feel like in that moment, this world you imagined became real, right? At least for me, it's the moment when readers come to me and tell me about what they thought of the characters, how they celebrated and how they suffered, how they cheered and how they cursed. And it's in those moments that I feel the characters have really come to life, that Dara has become real. And so, I say that, thank you to the readers who have given Dara life. And I really do mean that, until the moment it became a shared thing between me and all the readers. It wasn't even quite real, if that makes sense. It's like something that you feel and you say it. It's only until the person heard it that it becomes real. It's kind of like that. Um, so that's been one of the greatest joys of being a writer, to create this massive thing that took me so long. I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but while I was working on it, it really felt like I don't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. There were some parts that were like a slog. I mean, working on this, especially this last book, it took me 3 4 years of drafting and multiple rounds of revisions. Each revision pass would last a year or longer, because I have to go from the beginning to the end, and just revising the whole thing took me a year or more to do. And it really felt like I was one of those workers on the Great Sphinx or the Great Pyramid or something, where I couldn't see anything except this little square around me, and I'm like chiseling away with my little hammer, and I'm like, what the hell am I doing? I don't even know if the whole thing is crooked. I don't know if the whole thing's even there. Like, what am I doing? I had to do that day after day. It's very depressing. And then finally the whole thing is done, and I'm like, I'm so close to this darn thing that all I can see are these little chisel marks now. I have no idea if people can even read this thing and see the story I was trying to tell. What did I do? Did I even write down the story I meant to tell? And then, the readers actually read it, and they come tell me which parts they loved, which parts they hated me for. And I'm like, oh my God, it's real. This thing is real. So that was an incredible sense of relief and joy. I can't even describe it. It's so great.
I mean, we've talked before, I think, in the previous deep dive that we did on Steve's channel, about how stories is how we connect as humans. It's just what we do. So, you can have a story within yourself, but it's not until others hear and experience it that it becomes this bridge of connection that we always use. And that actually leads me to something that I have always felt from your books, and there's a lot of reasons that I love them, but I think I also mentioned before, I'm a linguistics nerd. I study linguistics, so the language part always stuck out to me. And I know the engineering is something that a lot of people notice, but for me, the language and the love that you put into the language parts of this book are what always really struck me. And it's also language that ends up being the connection or the linchpin point in many different situations. So Timu being able to take an action beyond the grave is down to language. You know, Zomi and Thera being able to connect is down to language. There's just so many examples of that. Even the giant bone Garnoffins in the end.
Yes.
It's sound and language that allows them to
That's
win.
right.
So for me, it's something that I picked up on, I know, because that's something I enjoy. But I wonder, as an author, was that something that you really wanted to impress upon your reader, or it just kind of naturally flowed when you're talking about civilizations on this large scale?
I think, you know, my career has in a lot of ways been based on metaphors about language throughout. So, you know, I was a software engineer at first, and then later on, I was a corporate lawyer before I went full time as a writer. But throughout these different jobs I had, I always thought of them in linguistic terms, believe it or not. It's actually quite interesting because I think a lot of these modern jobs are about manipulating symbols and moving symbols and building structures out of symbols, whether you're a programmer or a lawyer or whatnot. And so a linguistic metaphor came very naturally to me. In fact, I saw a lot of analogies in the way that engineering works versus the way, you know, say someone writing poetry or even a lawyer crafting a brief. When you're an engineer trying to solve a problem or a lawyer trying to craft a brief, you're essentially taking secondhand components to build something new, right? So when you're an engineer, you take these known solutions to problems and you try to figure out how to combine them in a novel way to solve the problem you're trying to solve now. And in the process, probably inventing a new component other people can use. When you're a lawyer, you're doing the same thing. You take existing known arguments, you put them together in novel ways and see if you can craft a new argument, a new theory. And that's essentially what poets do. Poets take cliches and put them in novel ways, together in novel ways to craft something fresh and new. And that's what language is always about. We're always using secondhand words to tell fresh, original stories. That's all we're doing. We're always using allusions, metaphors, idioms, and other cliches, components that have been used so many times, and then putting them in novel ways together to tell a new story. So this linguistic metaphor I've been sort of using throughout my career. And when I wrote the series, I think I said this before too. A long time ago, I wrote a short story called The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species, which is a very short story about how aliens might use the idea of language and writing in completely different ways than we do. That actually, I joke about this, but I'm semi-serious. The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species is in some ways the very short version of the Dandelion Dynasty, because the Dandelion Dynasty is an expansion of how many of the same themes about the role of language, of writing, of memory, of recording, of sound, of all things that we think of as in some ways touching on language. When I wrote the Dandelion Dynasty, I wanted to get some of my ideas and observations about language in there too. So some things that I think are interesting that I don't hear a lot of people talk about. So for example, if you remember, there's a huge amount of emphasis in the Dandelion Dynasty on the connection between language and localities. So I use the term topolect, which is based on the Greek word topos for place and lect for language. So a topolect is a language of a place. Now, topolect is a really cool word because it sidesteps the whole nonsensical debate between what is a dialect and what is a language. It's idiotic. Those kind of arguments are about politics. They're not about the lived experience. languages or topolects exist on a spectrum of mutual comprehensibility. And trying to draw a line between languages and dialects to me is useless. Topolect is a much better word. It's just the language of a place. That's it. And I emphasize just how important that kind of localism and connection is. I think because of mass communication and the flattening effect of the internet, we tend to pay less and less attention to the local nature of the languages we speak. But I'm really a hyper local person. I believe not only is it worth celebrating and preserving the uniqueness of the topolect of each place, whether it's a country or a county or a city or what have you, even at the level of individuals, we all, linguists tell us that we all speak actual idiolects. Even members of the same so-called linguistic community don't speak the same language. Every single person literally has their own idiosyncratic idiolect. A language that's unique to them. There are certain words that they use in a quirky way. That's just the way they do it. There are certain constructions they favor. And so all of us end up speaking a hyper personal, hyper local version of the language. And I wanted to emphasize that the fact that we do manage to communicate across these divides is miraculous. But I also want to celebrate the fact that this hyper personal, hyper local form of language is the way in which we retain our individual distinctness, our own distinct personality, our distinct window upon the world, our distinct way of describing the world. I even say that writers spend their entire lives trying to invent their own language because they have to invent a language in order to tell the stories they want to tell, the stories that only they can tell. And so the writers we end up celebrating and remembering are writers who have invented an entire new language just for themselves. Somebody like Jane Austen, who essentially invented the language in which all modern romances are written. Every Regency romance, every, bodice ripper you read is in some ways a fanfic of that. That's incredible for a single author to do this. Or Tolkien, who essentially invented the language of what we think of as modern epic fantasy. All of us have to, in some ways, writing echoes of that, secondhand words to tell our own stories. But that's what writers do. Great writers do have to spend their entire lives to invent that language that's unique, that idiolect that's theirs to tell the stories that they want to tell. So the Dandelion Dynasty is a reflection of that. The Liu have their own way of relating to language. The Aegon do as well, and the people of Dara have their own topolects and their own unique ways of relating to language. Language is the source of conflict and also the path to salvation and reconciliation. And somebody like Vokuferna was, a little micro version of that. Vokuferna was a Liu thing who fell in love with the written language of Dara and the deep literature of Dara. He is in some ways like Zankara, who had a deep love for the art and culture of Dara. And Vokuferna's dream was to be able to have his own poems written in the logograms, which he uses in a way that no one from Dara would ever do. And then his hope was that these poems would somehow be read and understood. And he never lived to see that. But in the very end of the book, if you remember, the children actually study his poem and read it, indicating that his contribution to Dara was recognized and accepted. And that, I'm sure, if he could see it, he would be comforted by that. And that's important to me, those moments.
And as someone who doesn't, I speak a different dialect, if you can call it, than my country's main language. So I really appreciated that you put in the fact that sometimes they couldn't translate words. There was just not a word to describe a certain dialect word in another language, and I really felt that it was really recognizable. That part of the language writing in the books.
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate consequences of this mass proliferation of big data and AI is that we're sort of forgetting about that part of real experience, which is that languages are unique, dialects are unique, and we have our unique words. My view, having Taylor, I mean, I'm sure you have your own view on this, and I hope this resonates, but people who have worked with different languages or have studied them ultimately come to the conclusion that translation is not really possible. Because even something like translating hello to bonjour is kind of ludicrous. They're not. They serve similar functions in some contexts, but they're actually not translations for each other. But AI, that's even like a simple example, much less more abstract, complicated instances. So translation is always sort of just your best approximation, and it has to be filtered through the mind of the person doing the translation. But the problem with AI, and oh, thank you, sweetie. My wife's bringing me coffee because I didn't get a chance to make it this morning.
The true
the
hero
fact that,
of
yeah,
the story.
exactly. So the fact that in AI, in something like Google Translate, it gives you the illusion that you can type in anything and will come up with one authoritative translation. That's the end of it. It creates the illusion that languages are just giant dictionaries. Like when people speak French, they're not really speaking a different language. They're just speaking English with different weird words for the words we have, something like that. Or, there's no such thing as Japanese. If you just take English and just take each word and translate it over into Japanese, you have Japanese. It's just so stupid. And yet over and over again, I see people falling into this mistake and thinking that's how it works, especially people who work in technology as I did. I've heard countless people say, "Oh, translation is such a solved problem." It's not. It will never be a solved problem because it's just how can it, unless you force everyone to speak the same language. Even then, translating between individual idiolects is a very difficult thing. So anyway, Hans, to get back to your point, that was the point. I really wanted to emphasize the lived reality of how languages work, and to emphasize to readers and remind them that this is how it is, because I just got really tired of the way people talk about translation as a Google Translate problem. You just have to find the mapping. It's a one-to-one mapping. No, it's not.
Yeah.
You unknowingly brought up a trigger from a fight I used to have in university all the time with the person I was with at the time. He was very technologically based. And then for me, he would say, like, well, translation is going to be AI based in the future. I'm like, that doesn't mean it's right. So we are on the same page with that one. I apologize, Hans. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I have a related question to that because, like in English, we use letters. So in your language, you use something akin to Japanese, Chinese, Korean characters, if I may draw that a comparison. So how was it to write the poems in your book, but then also have to figure out what kind of symbolism or character work the actual characters needed to use in order to bring those poems to, like, how did that work, that process of processing the poems in both sides of the language?
So I talked about how I crafted some samples of logograms for myself, right? I don't know if I showed you guys some of these. I think I did. But I made a few. So I made a few out of polymer clay logograms for myself. This is actually Mutaje, if you remember, and this is Renga. How you address the emperor. But anyway, so these are the logograms I made, sort of trying to figure out how they would work. So when I was crafting this, I thought a lot. I did a lot of drawings and a lot of sort of just free play thinking through about what text written in this written logogram system would look like. And I realized that because it's three-dimensional, unlike any extant human written language that we know, because it is three-dimensional, it has has several distinct qualities. One is that it can be read by the finger as well as by the eye. And so, there are passages in the books about people reading in the dark. It's actually really kind of cool. I really like that. It's very accessible in that way. And also the fact that because it is three-dimensional, visual aspects will pop out a lot more. So if you end up so in English, we do something like this where we use the same root multiple times, like poetry, something I studied. Poets often use the same root multiple times in a stanza, but it's not something that pops out unless you are someone who's really attuned to the roots of words and etymology and things like that. You don't necessarily see that. But in a language like this, it will pop out a lot more. The same three-dimensional little component would pop up every single time. So I was like, oh, that must be a much more important aesthetic aspect of it. So that's why I wrote about the images who concentrated a lot on the idea of making these visual repetitions, visual equivalents to consonants or assonants or whatever pop out more. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. That's really neat. And also because it's a three-dimensional written form, I can understand that poetry would be more than just a matter of sounds. So in English, we tend to emphasize the nature of poetry as a kind of music, as a sound. But, as somebody like E. Cummings showed, it can also be visual because we are a very literate society. We're very textual based. There is an aspect to the visual representation of poetry that's important, and even more so in a society like Dara, where the language is three-dimensional and so much harder to craft at the individual character level. I can see that the visualness of poetry would be an aesthetic pillar. So a lot of energy is devoted to making the arrangement of the characters looking balanced and pretty, and to make sure that there are visual components to it. So for example, the first character in the stanza needs to be of the same height as the last one. So in the same way that we think in, when we're writing a sonnet or something, the number of feet per line needs to be equal in order to have that kind of balanced feel. So I put in a lot of, that sort of thing as I was thinking about it. And then of course I have to, create all of these poems in English to try to give the reader a sense of what that was like. So I did think about, maybe I could do something like using the same root multiple times in the line to echo the way that a component was used in the same set of logograms. But then eventually I realized that that kind of thing would just be too clever. It's something that, those who do literary translation would be very familiar with. If you do literary translation, you sort of go through these stages where initially you're like, I want to be clever. I want to replicate everything. Like I want to find a really clever idiom that captures that. I want to find a really clever pun that captures that. I want to find a really clever device in English that replicates the Japanese wordplay. But then after a while, you're like, whoa, the cleverness is actually not helping at all. You're so clever that you've completely twisted the underlying aesthetic. You are so focused on the little clever things, you're emphasizing your own ego at the expense of the thing you're trying to do. So that's when I said, okay, I got to pull back. I'm just going to craft poetry in English in just like I used to do, but with the idea that I'm trying to reflect an echo of the way this would have sounded in Dara and this would have felt like to the people of Dara. So that's kind of how I did it. I ended up pulling back from a lot of the cleverness I was tempted to go into.
So based on more capturing the essence rather than
the feel of it. Yeah, the feel of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be pretty much impossible to accurately represent the same thing on a written page.
Yeah,
and this makes me.
It just doesn't work well. I've seen literary translations that try to do that, and it just ends up sticking out so much. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and this makes me admire the invention of the wedding zither. Is that the English word? The music instrument that writes. Because you have to make an instrument that can use, like a hand can mold the wax. And um, from reading, I thought it was like carving almost, but you make it seem like it's molding. So it's even more admirable to see that they invented a machine that could do that with no computers or no really advanced engineering
Yeah,
techniques.
it's a mechanistic version of a type. I mean, it is. That's what typewriters were, mechanistic.
Yeah.
But except trying to do logograms is much harder than to do the letters because, like you say, it's about carving. Now, carving is the only technique used by the writing zither because you're right. There are styles of calligraphy that's much more about molding and so on. But that's just much harder for machines to do. In the same way that in English, we have the ability to write using a brush versus a pen versus chiseling things right on the surface. So that's why modern English fonts or modern Latin alphabet fonts have such a variety of different looks because some of them are based on the idea of writing with a brush and some of them are based on the idea of writing with something much harder like carving. So I would say that the analogy here is that the Dara writing zither is capable right now, at least by the end of the book, of only reproducing carving-based calligraphy styles. It's not quite capable of replicating the much more gentle molding style of calligraphies. So maybe if someday I ever return to this world, maybe I'll work out the writing instruments for that. So you've given me an idea.
Well,
Yeah, that's
we'd all
cool.
read that. If you ever
Yeah.
if they ever came back to this world, I am there. I know that's a lot to ask though, because it was a lot to put on paper.
Yeah, and if I
So a
can
lot of
continue with another topic.
please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I really enjoyed how I'm more the inventions kind of person, so I was more excited to read about all of that. So I really loved how the books, the all four books, but mainly the last two books were kind of a transition into modernity, but related to engineering, but not in a traditional sense, in a very broad sense, because my favorite part of the Veiled Throne was the cooking contest. That
Yeah.
was one of my favorite things ever. And you would never think that inventions went as far as from a writing machine or what essentially is vinyl with the liuku, with the speaking bones, but also with creme brulee or other cooking techniques. So it was really cool to see all these inventions being invented by people looking at nature and then coming up with the engineering aspects in such a broad way that we got stuff like lightning detecting minerals, and it was really exciting to see all that broadness. So I was really excited to see an author that could focus on all of that broadness in invention and not like some books do only in warfare or only in like the inventions in entertainment industries and stuff were essentially important in warfare and the other way around. And I really love that synergy between all the different elements in the book.
Yeah, I that's like one of my own obsessions. I love reading histories of technology outside of warfare. There's the whole history of cooking utensils and cooking technologies. It's so fascinating and wonderful how ingenious people have been over the years in the craft of the kitchen. There's also in entertainment, just the very nature of special effects and what we've done over time to use light to perform feats of magic, essentially. I mean, if you go study how the earliest filmmakers in sci-fi especially who created those special effects to do what they do, wow, it's just wonderful to see what they got done. I just love that kind of innovation. Humans are really pretty cool creatures when we do this stuff. And I wanted to put a little bit of the joy that I felt when I was studying this sort of thing into my books, because just this is fun, coming up with new ways of entertaining ourselves and making better food. it's much better than inventing machines to kill people, which is often how we think about innovation. I'd much rather focus on these aspects.
Yeah.
That was a perfect comment, Hans, because that was exactly where I was going to go next, actually, was the restaurant scene. Because Drew had also mentioned in the comments earlier about it, saying the Splendid Urn versus the Treasure Chest restaurant battle was one of the most epic battles of any kind I've ever read in fantasy. I was very invested. And then also, I love to cook and have worked in restaurants, so I was on the edge of my seat.
That's
and
awesome.
I just want to second to that, because my husband is also a chef, so we've owned, small restaurants, small food stands as well, and I loved that scene. And I know for some people who read the series, it seems incongruous because, as you mentioned, in fantasy, typically those kinds of inventions are seen for the warfare, for a big battle that we're coming to, and we don't usually see it on this, because I would call it a battle, this form of a battle, and that being kind of the point of it at that moment. It is used later, but it doesn't have to be in order for it to be worth it.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that immensely as well.
I'm glad you did. I mean, I did want to have every book to have a little bit something that sets it apart. The Veiled Throne was meant to be one book with speaking bones, but the way the book was set up, I do naturally have a turning point in the middle of each of the books. I mean, that happened in The Wall of Storms and The Grace of Kings, so it happened in this third book. And so that turning point just happened to be a good place. It's at the end of what's now the third book. And I decided that instead of a typical epic fantasy battle like the Wall of Storms one, I would have a very unusual battle, the Battle of the Restaurants. And it is a battle, and there's actually a little bit of a meta commentary in there. If you recall, there's a little bit of a mock epic poem at the beginning of that, talking about how the generals are chefs and the battlefields are kitchens and all this stuff. That was meant to be that. It's like a very Alexander Pope style of mock epic poetry to get readers into the right mindset for what's about to happen. So I'm really glad that you did enjoy that. That was a lot of fun to write.
Yes, and just further most recent praise for it. Apology there. The cooking contest was one of the best things I've ever read.
Thank you. Thank you. That's awesome, Drew.
Yeah, it was the same for me. It's probably one of the scenes I'll recognize or remember the most from the entire series.
Yep. And that's also when, the Blossom Gang really came in and started doing their thing. I don't know, those four characters, they weren't in the original conception of the series, but they came in during the revision passes, and they demanded to have their own story, and I really loved them. I think they turned out to be really awesome. I can't imagine the books now without them, but they were in some ways latecomers. They showed up and demanded to have a place.
I'm glad they did. I love reading about them.
Yeah.
That does also, both you and Hans already touched on this, but the idea that these inventions can be made in a space that is separate from war or separate from the government or being used on that scale. But then later, to bringing up the Blossom Gang, they were, conscripted to use those skills in order to further their state and war.
Yeah.
And it's such because I realized when I was reading it that I didn't hate the act of them doing it, because I felt for their cause, right? Because of the perspective we're seeing it from. But as a concept, it is icky, but I didn't mind it so much in the moment. So it was like
this is something that we
cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, this is something we all have to sort of engage with a little bit. I was in the technical field, so I can speak from personal experience about some of this stuff. So I think a lot of times people underestimate the degree to which invention and discovery are really pleasurable acts. The act of inventing something and creating something, there's a real joy related to it. People often say, "Oh, how can you do that? And it's a hard thing to answer. So, Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, when people later on would interview him, and he was like, well, that's just not what you think about when you're doing it. When a thing is technically possible, there's a kind of, I don't know if he used the word, but there's a kind of sweetness to that thing that it's very hard to resist. You talk to scientists today, it's the same thing. There are plenty of artificial intelligence scientists who are very concerned about the potential for what's happening. We're not even talking about Terminator robots killing people. We're talking about just um, AI that's capable of, reconstructing what you're thinking about based on the MRI scan of your brain. That's actually just a recent paper that's just come out that it's doable. So we are not very far from reading people's minds, and so you can imagine what potential we're talking about here. And then you talk to these people, you're like, how can you do that? Are you not scared? Do you not see the consequences of what you're doing? And the answer is, we do, but there's a sweetness to the fact that a thing is technically possible and you want to do it, and it's almost impossible to resist. And I don't know how to explain this to people, but it's something that we're going to have to grapple with more and more. People always have this image of evil scientists who are doing it for evil. No, it's almost always never like that. But there is a sweetness to the fact that you can achieve something technically, that you want to do it. So, the cliche is the scientists just wanted to, ask if they could instead of whether they should. Well, the reality is humans are almost always like that. If you could, that is a really wonderfully attractive thing. There's a sweetness to that technical achievement, and that the should becomes really not part of the calculus. So yeah, I wanted to also talk a little bit about that in the books too. I wanted to put that in there because that's an aspect of the reality of it. The joy of discovery is real, and the thing you invent may lead to a sweeter dessert or a lot of people dead. And unfortunately, the technical sweetness is the same in both cases. And it's something we're going to have to just grapple with. It's the more we invent, the more powerful our inventions become, and both for good and ill. And we have to figure out how we're going to manage it.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
Can we manage it?
Yeah.
Right? Drew actually had a fantastic question here that I love, which is, if The Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones had been one book, what would the title have been?
It would have just been called The Veiled Throne. That was the title I came up with for the final book initially. It's not until we had to break it into two pieces that I had to come up with the title for the last book. And Speaking Bones is the right title. I really do feel it's the right title now. But had the whole thing just been one book, it would have been called The Veiled Throne. That would have been the end of it.
Interesting.
I felt there was...
Sorry, just so I can finish. That would have been a metaphor because, one of the core concerns with these books is about the emergence of modernity and what it means to be modern. And I would say that one of the most important aspects of modernity is the fact that we constrain power and we channel it in ways that we find acceptable. We tame the grace of kings, if you will. The idea of the veiled throne is that it will be a metaphor, that the power of the throne will be veiled, both in the sense of hidden and also in the sense of being disguised, also in the sense of being covered up, so that the sharp blade of the grace of kings wouldn't be so harmful. So it's all that wrapped up into one image. That would have been fine, but in the end, I realized that because we had to have the fourth book, Speaking Bones made more sense because again, that's a very evocative image. Speaking Bones is about the past speaking to us. It's about death being a source of power, of meaning. And you know, as someone who believes deeply in the importance of history and the relevance of history, speaking bones is important to me. I think I had this image in another story I wrote a long time ago, which is the idea that the dead are not gone. They're always with us. Wherever we step, we are surrounded by the ghosts and bones of those who came before us. And their stories are important to us because they demand to be remembered so that we can atone for their errors and to not make the same mistakes they did and to be better. So, speaking bones to me is a very literal, real, meaningful image. And so it does make sense as the title of the final book as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it metaphorical, but there are speaking bones in the book
Literally.
with gigantic bone structures.
Yes, exactly.
So it serves both purposes.
Two purposes, yeah. Just like there's a
Yeah.
literal veiled throne in the books too.
And in a more literal sense, do you want to base speaking bones on the giant machines that they built, or on the sort of vinyl that they make with the reading the voice paintings and the spirit paintings? What was the angle, or is it both? I don't know. Is it? Yeah. What?
Yeah, that one is very much based on my observations of sort of the age we're going through, right? So for the longest time, perhaps for a couple of thousand years at least, we have transformed ourselves from a primarily oral species into a literary species, right? This is something that theorists have been talking about for quite a few decades. The obsession that we in the modern world have with the written word, our utter obsession with it, despite all the flaws of the written word. I mean, Plato had this huge, long criticism of writing. He says that writing is actually really bad because when you read something, you think you understand it, but you're really capable as a reader of bending the words to any construction you wish. The author is not there to clarify your misunderstanding. You can't have a real debate with the author to understand because, Plato believes that knowledge and understanding can only come from a conversation where you have to argue back and forth until you really understand each other's ideas. This is sort of the extension of my idea that translation is impossible, and so even clear communication in a single utterance is impossible. You have to have a back and forth until the two of you get your idiolects to match. I think Plato is right. I have certainly found in my own experience that having an interactive exercise with a person to talk and debate is a much better way to understand an idea than to just read some single representation of it. But anyway, we had been a literate society for a long time, and we have accepted the idea that writing is the primary means by which we convey ideas and by which language achieves its formality, its status as something that embodies the truth. But we are now living through what I think of as orality 2.0, right? I mean, this is an age where not only are things like TikToks and YouTube Shorts and Snapchats and all sorts of oral communication coming to the fore, but even in our writing, so much of our writing now is orally inflected. Our texts and tweets and other ephemeral writing often have a deeply oral aspect to it, right? People people write in ways that reflect how they talk, or a very stylized version of oral conversation. And I think that's just deeply fascinating. We seem to be returning to the importance of orality. I've heard that there are users who now rely on something like TikTok or YouTube as a search engine. Like they do not bother reading things anymore. They just rely on videos. To me, that's wild. But I can see that. So the idea that writing is not primary, that the oral can actually be a foundational aspect of your social communication, and that you can achieve many of the benefits of writing with technology and spoken language is fascinating to me. So the Liuku are sort of a way for me to work that out. They are a society deeply suspicious of writing, of literate culture. And they managed to find a way around that by having recordings and having performances so they can achieve an oral culture that does not require writing. Now, the people of Tenadu, Zankara's people, she was pushing them to adopt a literate culture, but it has to be a literary culture that's suited to their own traditions. So these represent very different reactions to the pressure of literary culture. And I just found that really interesting to think about how different peoples and different cultures might react to the pressure of writing in very different ways, but that are suited to their own cultural beliefs and their own practices and what makes the most sense for them.
Interesting, very interesting.
I'm sorry that I had to pop out for a second there. Apologies for that.
No worries.
But as always, these go so quickly. We don't want to take up too much of your time. We are coming up on an hour and a half soon. So I wanted to kind of close out with overall thoughts of the series, right? So you deal with so many themes, and as you've mentioned, even in this chat alone, there are so many aspects that you wanted to talk about, with this series. And it's just, I feel like it's one of those series that no matter how many times you read it, you're going to be able to pick something new out of it. And that's part of the joy of it, right? Even in these discussions, revisiting it, I'm realizing new things. So I wanted to just kind of give everyone a chance here to say what they felt about the series as a whole and what their experience was with it. I think it's pretty clear I'm a fangirl. Again, I call this one of my favorite, if not my favorite, fantasy series of all time at this point, because even though I finished it almost a year ago at this point, I think about it all of the time, and I recall things from it constantly. So for me, it's become almost like a thought project. Like it's something that I revisit or think about the themes that it brought up. And I'm like, I marinate on that for a little while. We didn't even touch on the meddling gods or the religious aspect of these books, but that's something that really struck me as well, is how religion is not only a power structure, it actually acts in our society, and you give those actions a body in the story, but it's very indicative of what it's actually like. And so I find that this series is something that I will reread over and over again, but it's also something that I would recommend to specific types of readers who like larger scale thematic stories, right? So for me, it's, I don't know, just become a cornerstone of my reading journey. And I'm curious from Steve and Hans, and of course from you as well, Ken, but what the final impression of the series is for you at this point. Anyone can take it.
I'll go for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Hans.
Yeah. Okay. I really love it as well. I think it's one of my favorite as well. I think the most significant thing to me is how well you handled the characters, but how that isn't even the thing that I remember most from the series. Like, to me, this feels like a world. It's not really a story about characters, even though it is, but it's more like you're looking into the window of a world, and you feel the world through all the different layers of society, of the flora and the fauna, the inventions, the people that live there, the history. Like, you touch on so many areas that most other fantasy series or series in overall don't really even try to do. That for me, the legacy of this series in my brain is more like the overall aspect of it and how beautiful and wide it is. And I think that part of the story is going to stay with me for a while, even though I have a lot of characters that I also love from this series. I think that the world aspect is the thing that I will love the most going forward.
Yeah, I'm so glad you recommended this series to me, Taylor, because
You're
it's
welcome.
yeah, it was right up, it was perfect, but it's one of my favorites too. And Ken, you mentioned when you wrote it, you felt like you lived in it for 10 years. When looking back, I feel like I lived there too. Like it's so
That's
rich
really
and
cool.
vivid and lived in. And I don't feel like I read a story. I felt like I lived a story. I felt like I was there. Like it's a strange reflecting back on the journey. It feels like a journey, but it feels like I was part of it somehow. Like I was there along for the ride. So just I'm not sure how you managed to how to like juggle so many things at once and make it all work, but kudos because it really worked and it's
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing.
Comment from Drew here, been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for writing one of my favorite series of all time. I'm already looking forward to a reread.
Thank you, Drew.
And
Yeah.
also seeing a story unfold over generations and how the time jumps were handled were the best I've ever read.
Thank you. Really cool. So I just want to say a couple of things at the end here. I mean, one of them is actually a little long, but I think it makes sense. So, I mean, the series surprised me actually as the writer because it didn't end up being quite. It ended up being just a different experience than what I was anticipating when I started the journey. So I think I already told you this, but the inspiration for the entire series was, you know, my obsession with constitutionalism and with modernity and how we are trapped by history in a sense, and how that limits the way we think about ourselves. So this all started because I was traveling around the world to these literary festivals, and I was talking with writers and readers who described to me this thing that we don't have a word for. It's like nostalgia, but not nostalgia because it's not about yearning for something that's past, but yearning for something that never existed, which is this. Um, the sense of translatedness in modernity. So for a lot of people that I have talked to, they were not born into European languages. And so they say, you know, I speak my language at home with my grandparents and parents, and then I go to school where everything is taught in English. And so I learn about economics and history and even the history of my own people and physics and chemistry, and I do all that in English. And so when I go home and I try to talk about these subjects, there's a translatedness to it all. It's as though modernity doesn't belong to me, but to something that I can only understand through translation. It's a very strange feeling. There's a yearning of belonging to modernity that I can't quite put into words. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I started thinking about our own relationship to modernity for those of us who are born into English or who acquired it very early on. And it makes sense what they say, but I then realized something very interesting, which is this. Jack London actually wrote a story in which he talked about modernity and how Americans or English speakers in general thrill to the rhythm of the Anglo-Saxon, the tie ribs of Anglo-Saxon words. And then I thought about it, and then I realized that either on purpose or unconsciously, he was wrong about that. Because when we speak English these days, most of the words we use to describe modernity, like democracy, technology, chemistry, physics, these are not Anglo-Saxon words at all. They are words derived from Latin with Greek roots. So we are also speaking in a translated modernity. It's just that from the Renaissance, we always decided to just translate and repurpose using secondhand Greek and Latin roots to describe entirely new phenomena instead of our own Anglo-Saxon roots. That's very interesting to me. And then I realized that the United States actually is particularly interesting in this regard. we are a relatively young country, a new nation, but from the very beginning, we yearned for this rootedness in modernity, and we did it by essentially cosplaying as Rome, right? So you go to Washington D.C. and you see the Supreme Court looking like a Roman temple. You see the Capitol, and you have senators, and even the Federalist Papers were written by someone named Publius. There's something really ridiculous almost about the way we consciously cosplay as Rome, as though that's the only way we can make sense of modernity, which is a very strange thing. But our obsession with Rome has its consequences, right? Because we cosplay as Rome, the US also consciously or unconsciously view itself as repeating the steps of Rome. We view every threat as potentially a Carthage. And the only answer to that is Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. So everything is existential. Every time there's a threat, there's no way we can possibly live with them. We must engage in total destruction of the enemy. And that's a very Roman thing. Every time we see a problem, our answer is we must send the legions or the navy over to solve it. The Pacific or the Atlantic must be turned into our version of the Mediterranean. There's something about our cosplaying as Rome that really constrains our imagination. So I wanted to write The Grace of Kings really originally as a way to sort of reevaluate all of this. I was thinking, okay, so we've all understood the modernity of America through this Roman cosplaying lens. What if I could do something different? What if I could take an East Asian mythological route and then try to craft a US-like modern state based on that? What if we could have a modernity, a republic founded not upon the idea of emulating Rome, but founded upon the idea of having a mythological relationship to this sort of fantastical East Asia, and to reevaluate things like threats and opportunities, to reimagine our own historical role and relationship to oppression, to colonialism, to the use of force, to concentration of power. What if instead of using a set of Roman metaphors, we can use a set of East Asian references? What would that be like? I just wanted to see if it's possible to reimagine our own role as a modern country, and to reimagine the role of some place like the US, when we transmute it in this way, right? So that was the whole point of the project, and I hadn't seen anyone else do something like that. So that's what guided me into writing it. But in the process, it turned out to be so much more than that. It ended up being an entire meditation for me to re-examine my own relationship to modernity, to what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a modern person, what it means to be a literate person, what it means to be somebody who benefits from past oppression, and also who also suffers from past victimization. And this ended up becoming a really thoughtful and instructive exercise in my own relationship to the world that I live in. So, as I was telling Steve earlier, I felt like I lived for 10 years in Dara, but I ended up emerging from the other side with a better understanding of my own place in the real world. And that was really cool. It was not what I expected, and I ended up really enjoying it. So I will also obviously take this series to the grave with me, and that, because the impression made on me will be very deep and lasting. But it's not at all what I anticipated. So that was very cool. And also part of it also just comes from interacting with all the readers, with all of you, critics, reviewers, and readers who have seen their own, what they thought was interesting, what struck them about Dara, and they also, end up affecting me and allowing me to see my own work through a different lens, and that is also really cool.
We're back to stories, aren't we? Always back to stories,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And these conversations as well add a whole new perspective to it, because not only are these themes very much present in everything that you mentioned and your reason for doing it, but you can also just enjoy the story for the wonderful character work and the epic fantasy sci-fi conglomeration that it is, so it doesn't, it deals on both of those planes, and I think it's successful on both personally. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be screaming about it forever, so you can rest assured of that.
Yeah, and just like you mentioned, I feel like this book or these books really change meaning with the person that you're discussing it with, because I think you could discuss this in 10 different ways and come up with 10 different topics to focus on during the conversations, because there is so much to think about in these books.
Absolutely.
I'm waiting for the T-shirt line with all the great quotes from the series on just T-shirts. That'd be I would love that. So many
merch.
lines that I do.
We need Dandelion Dynasty merch.
Definitely.
Oh, pretty please. Well, this was absolutely delightful. Thank you for joining us and for giving us the chance to ask you all of these burning questions and get a deeper understanding of the project as a whole. I will, like I said, be rereading it for years to come.
That's really fun.
And I know Steve is also reading your short story collection currently, right?
We're reading it during our reading sprints. Yeah, the Paper Menagerie left us all a little bit teary-eyed, but it was a great one. Yeah, great stories.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you to Drew and everyone else in the chat, and anyone watching this after it goes live on YouTube. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy the Dandelion Dynasty as much as all of us did. And we look forward to nerding out about it at some other later date together.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. Such a joy for me to be part of it.
Thank you so much.
Same here.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, for now, though, we're going to head out. See you guys.
See ya.